People always think the weirdest, scariest stuff is buried in ghost shows or some found footage movie, but the heaviest stories I've ever carried with me came from people who swore they didn't imagine what they saw. You spend enough time talking with hunters, soldiers, divers, pilots, firefighters, night shift workers, real people who've had the dark press up against them, and you stop laughing off the things you can't wrap your head around. I remember this one guy, an avalanche rescue worker, who told me about something that happened in the Rockies. He said they were called out after a skier disappeared during a storm. They dug through drifts for hours and finally found the guy's pack and one ski pole wedged between two pine trunks. But no body, no tracks, no equipment scattered. The snow was fresh, untouched except for their own prints. They set up a base for the night because daylight was gone. He said that around 2 a.m. they heard a voice echoing across the ravine, not screaming but calling slow, like someone talking into the wind, and the voice used the missing guy's name. The search team followed protocol and didn't chase it because the terrain was lethal at night. But the voice kept drifting closer, then further, like something circling. At dawn, they found a strange pattern in the snow, a long, meandering path of indentations, not like boots or animal tracks, more like something sliding without weight. The skier's body turned up weeks later, miles away in a drainage area with no way of explaining how he got there, without gear, without food, without a single injury except a look on his face like he saw something ancient. Then you get these stories from divers. A salvage diver out of Norway told me about working on a sunken ferry in the Baltic. He said that when they're down there for hours, you get used to the dark and the pressure, but one time he was inside a partly collapsed dining hall, checking for structural hazards before extraction. His oxygen line was steady, comms were quiet, and then he heard knocking. 3 knocks, like from inside the hull. He froze, thinking maybe another diver had slipped in behind him, but no lights, no bubbles, nothing on the tether cam. The knocking happened again, slower, like whoever or whatever was doing it had all the time in the world. He said the scariest part wasn't the sound, it was that it vibrated through the metal in a pattern that felt intentional. When he surfaced, another diver said head, heard it too, through the line, like a heartbeat echoing underwater. Months later, a recovered security cam from the ferry's interior showed chairs moving during the sinking, not drifting, sliding like people were sitting in them while the ship tilted. There was a former park ranger from Utah who talked about working the backcountry zones where nobody goes without a permit. She said there was an area unofficially nicknamed the Stillwood because animals avoided it and compasses lost their mind. One summer, a hiker vanished there, so she and another ranger went to look. They followed a riverbed that twisted between rock walls. They found the guy's boot near a fallen log, but no footprints around it, no signs of a fall or animal attack. She radioed it in and kept searching alone while her partner returned to get gear. She said she started hearing this faint rattling, like pebbles dropping against bark. Every time she turned, it stopped. Then a wind slammed through the trees, even though the air had been still, and she swore the branches above her were bending in the wrong direction, like they were pulling instead of pushed. She left before sunset. The missing hiker was found a week later sitting against a tree miles from the trail, dehydrated and silent. He wouldn't speak except to say he didn't want to hear the rocks anymore. A pilot who flew medical evac missions in remote Canada told me about an old airfield they used occasionally. There was no tower, no crew, just a strip and a shack with a busted radio. One foggy night he landed with a nurse and a patient. The nurse stayed with the stretcher while he checked the shack for any supplies. He said as he opened the door, he heard Morse code tapping from a dead transmitter, just faint clicks. The air inside was colder than outside, like a freezer. The bulb in the ceiling flickered even though the generator was off. As he turned to leave, he saw frost steaming off the inside of the window even though it was early autumn. When he got back to the plane, the nurse asked if someone had arrived. They both heard footsteps outside on the gravel, crunching slow and dragging at the end, but the fog never broke and the steps faded like something walking into nothing. A month later, another pilot refused to land there at night because he said the runway lights flickered on by themselves when he flew overhead, even though nobody had touched the switches in years. Then there was this kid who used to work nights in a meat packing plant. Industrial freezers, huge metal rooms, narrow hallways. He said there was one freezer in the back that everyone hated going into alone. The place had been around since the 60s and had this yellowish light that hummed like a hornet nest. One shift, he went in to check a faulty latch. When the door shut, he heard what sounded like footsteps behind the shelves, fast and light like someone pacing. He called out thinking a coworker was screwing with him, but the footsteps stopped too quick, like they were listening. He walked down the aisle and saw condensation on one of the metal racks in the shape of a handprint, but stretched too long, like the fingers were twice the normal length. When he backed up, something scraped along the wall behind him, metal sliding on metal without any object near him. He yanked the door and got out. Another worker later told him that decades ago a guy got trapped in there during a power outage and wasn't found until days later. But the weird part? The design of the shelves had CH anged since then. The spot where the handprint appeared was exactly where that guy had been discovered, even though the whole freezer had been reconfigured after. An oil rig worker told me about a night shift out in the Gulf where the sky was clear and the sea was calm. Around 3 a.m., the lights on the platform flickered twice, then stabilized. Everyone thought it was a generator hiccup. 10 minutes later, one of the crew saw a figure standing near the edge of the deck, facing the ocean, hard hat, overalls, just looking out. When he called out to him, the figure didn't move. Another guy came over and said nobody was scheduled to be out there. When they approached, the figure walked along the railing but didn't make a sound, not even footsteps on the steel. They followed until it passed behind a storage unit, and it never came out the other side. They checked cameras later, and the spot showed static for that entire minute, even though every other feed was fine. The roughnecks joked about ghosts, but you could tell none of them wanted to be alone after dark anymore. I heard from a former paramedic in Boston who responded to a call in an apartment building scheduled for demolition. A squatter had phoned in about someone screaming on the top floor. When the responders went up, they found the rooms all empty, no furniture, windows boarded, but they heard muffled crying down a hallway. As they got closer, the temperature dropped enough that they saw their breath. The crying turned into this low humming, like someone trying not to sob. They kicked open the room it came from, but it was bare except for scratched words on the floor, carved into hardwood like with a nail, "Let me out." They backed off and left, and one of them said as they hit the stairwell, he felt a tug on the strap of his medic bag hard enough to spin him halfway around. When demolition finally happened, one of the workers said an entire support beam under that room was blackened like it had been burned from the inside, but the rest of the structure was untouched. A sailor who did research voyages in the Arctic told me about the time their icebreaker passed this stretch of silent water at night. No wind, just stillness. He was on deck alone and heard a splash behind the ship, not big but heavy like a person. When he looked back, he saw nothing. He leaned over the guardrail with a flashlight and saw air bubbles rising, but not like a burst, more like breathing under the surface. He thought it was a seal until something pale floated up just below the waterline. Not a body, not an animal, but a shape like a face with no mouth, just eye sockets too wide and deep. Before he could react, it sank straight down, not drifting. The next night, the whole crew was woken by the emergency bell because the motion sensors on the starboard side detected movement on the ladder, but nobody was outside. The log recorded weight on the metal steps, but no prints and no visual. There was this retired cop from New Mexico who said when he first joined the force, he responded to calls on the edge of Navajo land. One rancher radioed about lights in his field and someone walking among his cattle. The cop drove out and saw these tall, narrow shadows moving calmly between the animals, but as soon as he hit the brights, the shapes vanished like smoke. The cattle were all standing still, heads turned in the same direction, silent. He got out to check tracks and found depressions in the dirt like hoofprints, but arranged in a line like footsteps, each one facing backward. The rancher said his grandfather warned him that something old walked the land at night wearing shapes that didn't belong to it. A week after that, 2 calves were found dead, without marks, no injuries, just eyes wide open and tongues bitten clean through like they died mid-panic. Another story was from a guy who studied cave systems professionally. Head mapped hundreds of miles underground, he said, the deeper you go, the stranger the acoustics get. He and a partner were exploring a newly opened lava tube. About a mile in, his partner slipped and hurt his leg, so they stopped to rest. The guy radioed the surface crew and waited. As they sat in the dark with just headlamps, he heard faint clicking sounds echoing from deeper in the tube. He said it sounded like someone snapping fingernails against stone. Erratic but with pauses. They assumed it was loose rock shifting. Then the sound came from behind them closer, even though that path was sealed off. The partner asked if he heard breathing. The guy said yes, this slow, ragged inhale that didn't match either of them. When the rescue team arrived, the noise stopped. Later, when they reviewed the helmet cam audio, the clicks were there, but so was a low voice whispering something in a language neither of them knew, like syllables stretched too long. He left cave surveying a year later. One more came from a woman who worked nights at a rural hospice center. Most of the patients were in their last days, and the staff were used to the usual sounds monitors, footsteps, quiet conversation. But she said there was one room at the end of the hall that always caused equipment to malfunction. The bed would reset to sitting position, call buttons would trigger without being pressed, and clocks would lose time. One night she was making rounds and heard an old music box playing faintly. None of the patients had one. As she approached that room, the tune got louder. When she opened the door, the patient was asleep, but every piece of metal in the room rails, IV stands, door handles was vibrating like something was humming through them. The music stopped and the vibration faded in under a second. The patient passed away that morning at 4:17 a.m., and the clock in the room froze at 4:17 permanently, even after replacement. The thing about these stories is nobody's trying to sell you anything when they tell them. They're not pitching movies or writing books. They're mechanics solely. RS, nurses, people who've seen enough normal horror blood, storms, accidents that they don't get scared easy. But when they talk about the stuff they can't explain, there's a look in their eyes that doesn't fade. You start to realize maybe reality isn't this neat little box we think it is. Maybe there are cracks where things slip through, things that don't care if we're ready to see them. And once you hear these stories enough times, you don't walk alone at night with the same confidence. You glance at dark windows. You listen harder when the wind goes quiet. You understand that fear isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's recognition, like some ancient instinct waking up to remind you that humans haven't mapped everything, and the dark didn't surrender the world. It just stepped aside until it wanted your attention again.